talks, about an hour and 15 minutes.
Hitchens has written several books, a few of which include Hostage to History, No One Left to Lie to, and Unacknowledged Legislation. Christopher also writes for Vanity Fair and The Nation. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you. I know it's Sherry. I just was pausing. I was pausing with exquisite gallantry. Thank you, Sherry, for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. It's kind of sad that on a beautiful evening like this, there are so many Bostonians with nothing better to do. But on the other hand, it's kind of flattering that this number of you would prefer me to the Red Sox. As Sherry mentioned, I'm out on the road with a smile and a shoe shine, being a salesman for 2 books, including my collection of essays on literature and poetry. And I was recently in that capacity at Beloit College in Wisconsin. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's excellent. There's always somebody. It's a great college, and has a very, very good English department, and furthermore, they give you a really serious dinner beforehand at the Gun Club, where I was asked, would I be able, in talking to the English department students, to mention my book on unacknowledged legislation in the same breath as Henry Kissinger? In other words, could I mention him and Shelley in the same breath? Since, as some of you will already have guessed, the title of the first book is a straight lift from Shelley's essay in defense of poetry. And I thought, no, I don't think I can do that. I probably shouldn't even think about it. There's something profane in the suggestion. But then I did think about it. The invitation seemed like a challenge, and I thought, of course I can. And not only that, I should. And indeed, I cursed myself because this could have gone in the introduction to both books and made both of them better. It's this. It's only a couple of degrees of separation. Before he became the magnificent mammal that we all know today, Henry Kissinger was a fairly average member of the pseudo-intellectual think tank academic community. And in that capacity, he wrote a couple of undistinguished books. One of them on the problem of nuclear warfare, which he wrote for the Rockefeller family. The problem with nuclear weapons, he said, was how unusable they were. The solution would be to make them more usable. This is the origin of the term tactical nuclear weapon, the stupidest apposition of words, I think, until nuclear umbrella made its appearance. And a second book called A World Restored, which is a paean or hymn to the short-lived, oppressive, reactionary political settlement imposed on Europe in the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo and the Congress of Vienna. It's associated with the names of Prince Metternich, of Lord Castlereagh, and of other reactionary politicians of the time who tried to define European stability as a polity that excluded the inconvenient peoples of, say, Poland, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and of course the Jews, and of course the Americans. Anyway, that's one of the reasons it didn't last very long. And the leading opposition to this was supplied by the poets of the day, notably Byron and Shelley. Shelley had a particular dislike for Henry Kissinger's great object of admiration, Castlereagh. And Shelley, having written a number of poems, wrongly in my view called romantic, against this terrible regime, began a poem with the lines, "I met murder on the way, he had a face like Castlereagh." So there you see it can be done. And bear the lines in mind and think of this face. I don't know how many of you can see it. This face, ladies and gentlemen. Probably a lot of you are old enough to remember times when it's been told to you as voters and taxpayers that some atrocious course of action is necessary in some obscure corner of the world in order that face not be lost, or in order that face be saved. I have to ask you again to consider how many of you would agree to have somebody bombed or tortured or murdered or disappeared or assassinated to save this face, or that of his equally beautiful patron and friend Richard Nixon, another face which I won't need to hold up to recall to your minds, because the invitation I'm making to you is a serious one, morally serious one. In point of fact, many, many, many thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, good people, people better than this man, people better than his boss, were put to death to save those faces. And I'm here to make the case for the prosecution of those deeds. And I suppose I'm encouraged at the thought that obviously I'm pushing at an open door with some of you, but believe me, I'm willing to push on a closed one too. We have a time constraint this evening. I have 20 minutes. I will be prepared in question time and later on the pavement, if need be, to materialize everything I say. I will make no assertion I can't document or support or back up. And I'll begin like this. Who of you could honestly raise their hand and say that they had recently heard the expression peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power? I see. That's all? Has no one else recently heard the expression peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power? Is it fading so soon? I thought that there was a time, doesn't seem very long ago, when you couldn't turn on the radio or the TV without being assured that that's what you were having. You were having a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power. Some of you may even have thought, if we're having such a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power, why do we keep on having to be assured that we are having peaceful, democratic? If they go on telling us we're having a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power, one might begin to doubt that one is in fact having a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power. But for all that cynicism, it's no mean thing to be able to say that you live in a society where that is true, where it's you who determine who the government is, and no one is allowed to interfere in that choice. So I'm going to start with the election of 1968, the summer of 1968, when two things were evident. One, it had been concluded by a majority of the American political establishment and by, I would say, a pretty large majority of the American people, that the war in Indochina was, at the very best, a terrible mistake and should be brought to an end as soon as possible. There was a large minority, of which I was one, who thought it was much worse than a mistake, that it was a horrendous crime. But there was a big consensus to wind it down. This consensus, by the way, included Dr. Henry Kissinger, as he then was. But a second thing was happening, which was that the Richard Nixon campaign knew that this was Nixon's last chance to become president. And they evolved the following plan, that they would go to the South Vietnamese military junta in Saigon, led by General Thieu, and they would say to them, they had to do this privately and covertly because it was illegal and treasonous to do it, they would say to them that if they, the South Vietnamese, would withdraw from the peace negotiations that the US government was then sponsoring in Paris, and would time that withdrawal for the eve of the election, that the incoming Nixon administration would give them a better deal, would give the South Vietnamese a better return. The people who did that, Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, John Mitchell, have since been exposed for having done it. I have the entire story in my book. This used to be a speculation, a hypothesis in Washington, but then so did the theory that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was fraud. This story has now moved to the point where it's part of the official record. We actually now possess the FBI transcripts of the bugging to which President Johnson subjected the Nixon campaign while it was doing this atrocious covert action. I mentioned the name Nixon, Agnew, Mitchell. There was a fourth man, Henry Kissinger, who was attached to the negotiations in Paris in his capacity as a liberal Republican. And he was the one who, from Paris, secretly revealed the US government's negotiating positions through a back channel to Richard Nixon, so that in Mr. Nixon's subversion of the election and of the peace negotiations, he always had perfect knowledge from informers. And on the 3rd of November 1968, the South Vietnamese did pull out of the Paris peace talks, bringing them to a halt, sabotaging them completely, and destroying the peace plank of the Democrats' re-election campaign. And Richard Nixon duly became a president, and on his first day in office, and on the second time only he'd met him, and the first time he'd ever met him alone, invited Henry Kissinger to be his national security advisor. And Mr. Nixon did not like Jews. He didn't like academics, even pseudo-academics. He didn't like intellectuals, even pseudo-intellectuals. He didn't like the East Coast universities. Didn't like the type at all, but he knew talent when he saw it. And a star was born, and a one-man international rolling crime wave began, and the beginning of it was this. The illegal mortgage on another 4 years of the Indochina War that had been taken out without the knowledge of the American people, because not even the Johnson administration dared share what it knew about Nixon's covert action. That illegal mortgage had to be paid off, and it was paid off, with 4 to 5 years more of the war, and not just of a war in Vietnam that was already a war of aggression and atrocity, but by extending and deepening that war, expanding it to Cambodia and to Laos, and to heavy further continued bombardment of North Vietnam. And of the names that appear on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, my hometown, very nearly half, some 22,000, were incised in stone on dates after the inauguration of the Nixon-Kissinger team. And we would not have the resources to build a wall big enough on which to inscribe the names of the Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians who were killed in that time. I often think we don't even want to know how many there were. And there would be no way, there still is no way of computing the incredible damage done to the ecology and economy and society of those peoples. And that was how the Nixon-Kissinger adventure began. And that's the first item in my bill of indictment. And if you combine the two elements of this, the sabotage, the deliberate sabotage of an American presidential election, and the sabotage and subversion of the ongoing Paris peace negotiations on Indochina into one single act, which they do form one single action, I say it's the wickedest thing ever done in American political history. And I've so far had no challenger to say that this has a rival for that. But I should pause, but not for long, to let that sink in. I'm pressed for time. I can move on to another peaceful, democratic, orderly transition of power, if you like. Not long after this, the people of Chile had an election. The Chilean people were very proud of the fact that they had a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power in their country. They had a tradition of it. They were the envy of their neighbors in Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay and Argentina. For that very reason, the army had never intervened in a Chilean election before. They were rightly proud of this. But in the year 1970, the wrong party won that election. The wrong candidate won it from the point of view of Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger. And it was decided to find and finance and arm and induce some Chilean officers who would break that tradition and would bring the army into politics and elect a government that Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger would like better. Or, I said elect, I'm so sorry. Impose such a government. There was an obstacle to that plan. There were several obstacles, as well as Chile's long tradition. There was an individual named General René Schneider. He was the head of the Chilean Armed Forces. He was a decent conservative officer with a constitutional cast of mind. He had taken his oath to the Chilean Constitution, was not prepared to break it. And therefore, it became necessary to make General René Schneider go away, have him removed from the scene. And I have in my book the transcripts of the meetings at which Henry Kissinger, in the chair, arranged for the murder of General Schneider, arranged for the murderers to be found. They chose a gang of experienced men of violence, people with renowned records for violence and political extremism, fascists, actually, to give them their proper name. They sent them money through the American diplomatic bag and sophisticated weaponry through the American diplomatic bag of Santiago in order that the execution could take place. Libya gets bombed, by the way, if it uses its diplomatic bag for purposes like that. And in due time, the general was shot down in the street. And now we know, we've only known this since last December, when on the initiative of Congressman Morris Hinchy of New York, all the documents were finally revealed to Congress, that the murderers were then paid off with a very large sum of American cash money supplied by Henry Kissinger, and were helped to conceal the evidence of their crime. And this was the opening, this assassination, this murder, and when you read the transcript of the discussions and the planning and the organizing of it, it's like listening to the John Gotti tapes. It's not like The Sopranos at all. It's a cold-blooded, wet job. It's a hit. It's a whack done by this man, this individual, this person, Kissinger. You realize it's only also the prelude to the assassination of Chilean democracy itself, because within 3 years, tactics like that, repeatedly applied, of sabotage, murder, terror, and assassination, had produced a military coup which asphyxiated democracy in Chile for nearly a quarter of a century. But the Chilean people are back now, and they are instituting inquiries into what happened to them and to their chosen leaders and to their society. And as a result of this, on Memorial Day this year, I'm talking about 3 or 4 Mondays ago, in the Ritz Hotel in Paris, Henry Kissinger was hit with a summons by a French judge, Judge Roger Leloir, who is investigating the disappearance of 5 French citizens who fell victim to General Pinochet's death squads. And Mr. Kissinger, I wish I had been there for this, I'm bound to say, Mr. Kissinger had the summons read to him in translation by the manager of the Ritz Hotel, saw that it required his presence at the Palais de Justice the following day, and ran out of town. Okay? You haven't read it in the New York Times yet because it's not the sort of news that's fit to print. But you will. It isn't in the Washington Post either. It isn't in the Los Angeles Times. It hasn't been on any network. But it is true, and you can look it up. Mr. Kissinger has also been hit with a summons by the judge in the Pinochet case in Chile to answer questions again about Operation Condor, the internationalization of the death squads of South America into a continental-sized weapon of disappearance, torture, kidnap, and repression of dissent, and also by Judge Rodolfo Corral in Argentina, who's pursuing similar inquiries. In other words, one of the best-known graduates of a school not far from where we're sitting, in your case, is now wanted for questioning in 3 democracies on 2 continents and is refusing to answer the questions. That's the state of affairs now. And I consider it an occasion for making a little holiday in my heart. But I call it... And again, I'm glad that you concur, but why did I say a little holiday? Why not a big holiday? Because isn't it an absolute disgrace? Is it not a shame that everyone here should feel that the pursuit of justice in this matter is being left to impoverished victims in other countries who've already had their family members tortured to death? That they are expected to scrape together the resources to hope to get a hearing somewhere in the United States, where this man lives as an honored citizen in Midtown Manhattan and rubs shoulders with the white trash of New York society and is the independent, detached, impartial news consultant for ABC and has a column syndicated by the Los Angeles Times, even into my hometown rag, the Washington Post. And there's no one in the United States who's prepared to serve a summons on this man. There's no one in Congress to say it's our responsibility to seek justice here. Does the United States not go around the world insisting on the speedy delivery of other war criminals to instant justice? Aren't we indeed delighted to see that Mr. Milosevic was finally collared today? I certainly am. But we do not talk to our own society in the language, the peremptory terms we quite rightly employ with Serbian fascists, or with Rwandans, or indeed with Germans, or Brazilians. We tell them, no, you must face your history. You must face it openly and honestly. You must open the archives. You must bring your criminals to justice. You must have, in other words, a truth and reconciliation, or truth and justice, I would prefer, commission. And that's what we need here, and have needed for some time. And Exhibit A is my subject, Henry Kissinger. And it is an appalling thing that only the victims are so far pursuing the justice that is their right for crimes committed against them by us, or by people acting, at any rate, in our name. Though I suppose it could be said to flatter you a little, ladies and gentlemen, that at least this regime never dared tell you the truth. At least they felt they had to lie to you about it. But that's why this campaign is also one for historic truth and for open government, as well as for justice. In other words, it's high time it was taken out of my poor hands. The stakes in this are very, very high indeed. Would you like some more orderly, democratic, peaceful transitions of power before I close, or before I pause, at any rate? All right. Next year sometime, I think I have time for one more, do I? Next year sometime, I devoutly hope and believe, the people of East Timor will have an election which will simultaneously make them an independent country and a democracy. That'll mean they'll be having this, the few of them who remain. It's been very hard to find even a pulse in East Timorese society in the last few years after decades of massacre and famine and repression. But Indonesia has now evacuated the territory. Now they are having an independence election, and they're being shepherded to independence under UN aegis. Well, all those last 3 things were supposed to happen in 1975. They've been waiting a long time for this peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power. In 1975, when the Portuguese colonial authorities began to evacuate East Timor, it became an international responsibility of Portugal and the UN to shepherd the people of East Timor to independence and to democracy. But the Indonesian dictatorship, the nearby dictatorship, had another plan. They thought it would be better if Indonesia occupied and annexed the people and territory of East Timor. I say the people and territory of East Timor in point of fact, to be blunt about it, and the record supports this. the Indonesian generals thought they'd rather have the territory and not the people, since the people were not Indonesian, and since they were actually, as it happens, a religious minority. They're mainly Catholic. So they evolved a plan whereby they took the land and they subjected the people to a campaign of genocide. That's been amply and substantially documented, and I don't need to prove it to anybody, I know. But what isn't as widely known as it could be, or should be, is that on the day they took that decision, Henry Kissinger was sitting in the room with the Indonesian general staff and approved in advance and gave the go-ahead and green light for that invasion. And in the subsequent campaign of massacre, food denial, the use of famine as a political weapon, and so on, made sure that the Indonesian armed forces never ran out of money and was prepared and did in fact break American law in order to do so, because the Foreign Assistance Act, among other things, prohibits the use of American weaponry for any purpose other than self-defense, and the Indonesians never even claimed that they were defending themselves against the tiny population or state of East Timor. And I have all the documents in my book of how Kissinger knowingly encouraged this course of action, violently broke international law in the illegal annexation of East Timor, ignored the Genocide Convention, and broke American law in order to make sure that the butchers became aware that they need never fear a shortage of weaponry to complete the task. And upon leaving office a short while afterwards, was rewarded with a half share in a very large gold mine run by the Indonesian military dictatorship, of which he remains a director, as he has and remains a director of a number of other military corporate consortia in Indonesia, and in fact has made a second career out of franchising contacts between despotisms and the corporations who like them. It's called Kissinger Associates. It's a very well-respected firm in Midtown Manhattan as well, and it gets in many consultancies and spaces on the op-ed page. That was what the language of peaceful, democratic, orderly transition meant to the people of East Timor, and there's no one to speak for them, and it would be a very sad day for them if that job was left to me, quite clearly. So I think I can hold it there. I can invite your questions. As I say, I'm prepared to defend every assertion that I've made, but I suppose if I look for a means of closing decisively, I would say that I hope that you yourselves might decide to enlist in this campaign. You have rights in this matter too, and the United States, this republic, is now at a stage where it cannot simultaneously lecture the rest of the world upon the universal application of standards of human rights and of political justice, and continue to flout and defame and disfigure these same values by harboring this man or by refusing to admit what was done to save this face. Thank you. Thank you again. I'm at your service now. It might perhaps be thought invidious if I pointed to questioners, in that I might, for all you know, have brought members of my family or... So would someone else would you perhaps point to recognized questioners?
How about way in the back in the green shirt?
Just your luck.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, life, he's young enough to find out life is unfair.
I like to start from the back and move up front.
Huh?
I like to start from the back.
Yeah, sure.
Why did the Johnson administration not reveal Nixon's version of the peace talks, either himself or through a leak? The media maybe, whatever. It seems perfectly advantageous for them if you like to do so.
Yes, a very good question. Was it heard by all? Okay, I'm sorry, I have to ventriloquize your question, sir. I was asked, why did the Johnson administration not reveal what it had learned by the bugging of the Nixon campaign in 1968? Well, it's a hotly disputed question, still among the people who are around who remember it. I mean, like Richard Holbrooke, for example, who's a member of that delegation, who's still very outraged about what happened. The best clue, I think, is in the memoirs of Clark Clifford, who was Johnson's right-hand man at the time, and wrote one of the first published accounts of the thing, though we didn't then have the FBI transcript. Johnson didn't want to admit that he'd been bugging the other candidate's plane. That's one thing. The other thing, but I think it weighed even more with people like Clifford and also with Hubert Humphrey, who feared two things. One, it could look like dirty pool on his part, but two, you have to remember, that year, a large number of citizens had in effect seen through the government. I mean, there was I remember it myself, and some of you younger people will have read about it. There were riots in the streets and on campuses. There was the feeling that not just an appalling thing had been done to the people of Indochina, but a terrific rape of the American Constitution had taken place, that Congress had been lied to, that the system was breaking down. Well, if they knew what the Nixon gang was up to and had been doing, and how easy it was to continue to make end runs around democracy, what might have been the harvest? In my opinion, this, by the way, will hold true in all cases. What unites both major parties is much larger than greater and tighter than what divides them. What would have been at stake here was the survival of the consensus itself, and they weren't going to make a move that would have done that. But Nixon did later try, when he himself was caught bugging the Democrat headquarters, did try to use it as blackmail to prevent the release of the tapes. But it didn't work, because he was then told by Johnson and his heirs, if you do that, we will tell the American people what we were bugging you for. And that's in the Haldeman diaries. And that is, in my opinion, one of the reasons why Henry Kissinger urged Richard Nixon to burn the tapes rather than surrender them under subpoena. Remember what this guy has done to your country as well as other people's. Bear that in mind. You have a reckoning with him too.
How about right to your, yes, this gentleman. No, right behind you. We'll get him.
Responded to you somewhat. Among the things he has said about you is that you are a Holocaust denier, which you are not apparently. Could you speculate as to where he got this idea, and tell us why it is that you have threatened lawsuits against Kissinger for his remarks? I always thought you had been a defender of free speech to the max, in the mode of a Noam Chomsky, for example,
To be sure.
who defends vicious lies as free speech to his credit. Why aren't you in the same camp as Mr. Chomsky?
Well, it would be impertinent of me ever to put myself in the same category as the Duke of Lexington, but I perfectly understand the grammar of your question. Here's my reply. You're kind to say that apparently, or in other words, I don't appear to be someone who doubts the occurrence of the Holocaust. I could secretly be one. I mean, there's no way I could. But there's no reason for anyone to say that I am. And those who do say it at their peril, because it is a very gross defamation, and it's also an attempt to change the subject away from the question Mr. Kissinger was asked, which was what is your response to Mr. Hitchens' allegations? That's the first mistake he made, was to make it too obvious he was trying to change the subject and to change it in a hysterical way. The second is he pissed me off. And I am going to sue him because I want this question cleared up, because it's been brought up against me by some other crankish and cultish people who object to actually object to me in general, but think that I've made a mistake in defending the First Amendment rights of David Irving, the historian, which I have done and continue to do. And so to your closing point, I'm a First Amendment absolutist, of course. I don't want Kissinger to stop saying it, and I have no means of imposing prior restraint on him. He can carry on saying it, for all I care, as he does all his other lies. But I point out to you that in the discovery stage of a libel action, it will be possible for me to show that he is a habitual, pathological, consistent liar. And I will bring the evidence into court that shows that. That's why he's made such a big mistake. And I will say when it's over, he can go on saying that he didn't know anything about East Timor. He can go on saying he didn't know what was happening in Cambodia. I can't stop him doing that, but we will have established, and he'll have had to pay for the fact that these are lies. So it's a blunder that he's made, because he can be deposed under discovery. And that's what I'm considering doing to him. It'd be long and arduous and expensive, but it seems to me that it's an opportunity that ought not to be missed. But his right to express himself, I'm afraid, isn't something I would want to qualify, but in any case, I can't.
Okay, gentleman in black right here.
your claims, but why, can you explain why the particular interest in Kissinger and events since 1968? My impression, as a non-historian, is that this has been going on from the beginning of this country. And I was amazed to learn something that you probably understand, that in 1778, George Washington ordered what can only be called ethnic cleansing of Indians in the Binghamton area. I was there a few months ago, and they are trying to build a Holocaust memorial because, and I looked up the documents in the library, and in Washington's biography, he actually sends to his General Sheridan or whoever it is, or Sullivan, an order to clean out the Indians because they're interfering with the war effort, and he did. Now, why suddenly an interest in Kissinger and events since 1968?
Was the question heard audible? Yes. Well, I'm going to tread carefully and not be accused of denying the Iroquois Holocaust. But I think the question must have become obvious, the answer must have become obvious to you even as you were speaking. There's no way of putting George Washington on trial. Okay? That must have struck you. Okay?
Just as the German
I say that
people
it's
were on trial.
well, I don't think it's possible to put the American people on trial. I think it's possible to say that though the huge attempts are made to distract people from the fact, and people are willing to be distracted from it, that this does represent something of a moral crisis and a political crisis for the American society, yes, and in real time. Now, if you'd said, well, what about Robert McNamara, for example, I'd say, well, that's a good point. Kissinger was in many ways the executive of others in doing this, but I think there are two things. One, partly because of the criminal way in which it was originally conceived, the Nixon administration imploded, and in the last 2 or 3 years of it, Henry Kissinger was in effect the president, at any rate for foreign and defense and security, national security purposes. And as a result, we know more about what he did, and he was able to do so much of what I call his international one-man rolling crime wave, that there's enough evidence for a French judge to issue a summons. In other words, that the statement Henry Kissinger is a war criminal is a statement I've been making, and I dare say you have, for many years. It's now not a piece of rhetoric. Okay, it's not a metaphor. It's a job description, and it might feature on an indictment. So I decided to write this book, which I could have written in a different form, and give it this title instead of another, and this shape instead of another, as a consequence of the arrest of General Pinochet and the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic, because we now live in a world where, in fact, it is possible that universal jurisdiction will become the principle of courts in democratic countries, universal jurisdiction over war criminals, and sovereign immunity will cease to be a defense. In other words, you won't be able to say, yes, I did kill all those Chileans, but I was hoping to impress Richard Nixon. Now, until recently, that would have been a defense. Not great, but it would have been one. Now, the British House of Lords now says that won't work. Do you want to live in a society that has less respect for the rule of law and democracy than the British House of Lords? I would, if I was you, sir, and I say this with all respect, I'd concentrate on that rather than on 1778. I really would.
Trial for bombing Belgrade.
Clinton, in my view, could not be put on trial for bombing Belgrade. But Mr. Clinton, in my view, could not be put on trial for bombing Belgrade, but he could be put on trial for bombing Khartoum.
Okay, let's start over here, the woman in the second row.
I would like to thank you for this book on Cyprus, and I would like you to say something about this issue, because Cyprus is is waiting for justice for 27 years now. So would you please?
Yes, by all means. The lady asks me if I would say a bit about the Cyprus question, about which I have a chapter in this book, and I'm happy to do so, and I'm sorry I didn't have time in the opening stages. It's another peaceful, democratic, orderly transition, as a matter of fact. Cyprus, but in this case from democracy to dictatorship, and not peaceful and not orderly. It's another transition, though. The island of Cyprus, which had been independent, former British colony, predominantly Greek in ethnicity and language and religion, since 1960, was the envy of the military dictatorship which, with American connivance, governed Greece from 1967. The Greek military dictatorship wanted to annex the island of Cyprus by force. And because Greece was a dictatorship and Cyprus was a democracy led by President Makarios, who was steadily and regularly re-elected by his people, Henry Kissinger naturally preferred the dictators to the Democrat and gave support to their plan to assassinate President Makarios as a prelude to the full-scale military coup and military takeover of the island, which I can't tell you the whole story in anything but a much longer time, but which triggered 2 Turkish invasions of the island and culminated in the situation we have today, an artificial partition imposed by NATO by force on a democratic people, a democratic island which can't threaten and never has threatened anybody else, solely because its political independence posed a threat to neighboring military dictatorships. Kissinger had guilty knowledge at every stage of the plan to murder Makarios and to do this to the people of Cyprus, and I've told the story in a book I wrote some years ago about the subject. It's actually how I first got interested in him. And with more and fresher documents that have come to light, making it even more horrifyingly clear since in this book. So I'm very happy to take up the lady's invitation and to urge you not to forget that still, to this day, in Cyprus, people are paying in the form of 200,000 refugees, many hundreds of missing and disappeared people, and a military occupation and an arms race and the threat of another war, still to this day paying a very heavy price for Henry Kissinger's diplomacy, which, as ever, relied on the forces of fascism and criminality.
I dare say you or the forces of justice may have Kissinger a little bit on the run in this country as well, judging from the fact that just two days ago he canceled an appearance that was to have taken place in the same series. And no one is quite sure why, I don't think, but I have my suspicions. My question is, and I don't know if you write about it in your book, but when Kissinger was at Harvard, he had the habit of writing letters to the local office of the FBI, at least some of this is a matter of public record, informing, quote unquote, on supposedly suspicious colleagues. And I wonder if you're aware of this propensity that Kissinger showed before he became better known, and if you could talk about perhaps what this may have presaged in terms of Kissinger's later behavior.
Well, to the first observation, this is the second time I've been to one of his hometowns and failed to meet him. I was invited by a group of people in Washington, Connecticut, where he lives, to come, people I didn't know, but when they heard that he was to be made the luminary of the local library in a ceremony, they invited me to give a reading at the Hickory Stick bookstore across the green. And I said yes, and Kissinger pulled back. He went back inside his compound and wouldn't come out to play. In fact, that left the library committee. Washington, Connecticut's full of weekend New Yorkers who like a bit of culture, and they like to raise funds and have dinners, but they were left without a luminary for the dinner, so they asked me, since there wasn't another visiting author on the scene. And at first I thought, I'm not going to sit in the chair that was reserved for that swine, but then I thought it would be pompous. So I ate his dinner. And I must say, I candidly don't believe that a man like this with a publisher like Simon & Schuster would put the Harvard bookstore to all the trouble of booking the Charles Hotel, giving out tickets, making publicity, and to discover at such short notice that he had a scheduling conflict. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. It's too rude a claim, it's too crude a claim to make to be believed, even from such a man. And I do also know that at the National Press Club last week, he made it a condition of his appearance that no questions about my book be asked. And I'm sorry to say, got the chairman to agree to this, but there's a row about that now. But as I say, it's about time it stopped being just me. Fun though this is, and I'm sure we will one day meet. That he was a rat and a snitch doesn't surprise me in the least. I didn't know it. It wouldn't make much difference either to my book, because this book, you'll see, is reassuringly cheap and quite short. If its title was Vile Things You Should Know About Henry Kissinger, I decided not to do that precisely because I don't know when I'd have got through that. There's an enormous, I even say, I give a list of 8 atrocities in the beginning of the book that I decided not to deal with because, revolting though they are, what was done in Kurdistan by Kissinger, for example, what was done with the Shah of Iran by Kissinger, what was done in Lebanon by Kissinger, what was done during Watergate by Kissinger, all these things. None of them, unfortunately, met my standard of Pinochet-Milosevic. And that's the bar I've set, and my last chapter, I'm proud to say, has been proved right. I said there would be people proceeding against him in other countries, seeking justice under the new precedents, and there have already been 3, and I can promise you there will be more. He's never, I make you this promise, he's never going to hear the end of this. From now till the day he dies, he's going to be haunted and harried by this.
Gentleman in the blue shirt, the second row. Just wait till the microphone gets to you.
Is that mic supposed to be working?
I actually have a question on exactly that topic, which is where do you think we might see him brought to justice? Perhaps Belgium or France, or I'm just curious as to where you think he might actually face a trial.
Well, I know, and I say in my book, and I have a tape of him having a very anxious conversation with his publisher about where he's able to travel now. He doesn't travel without taking legal advice. And obviously, it isn't always that good, the advice, because he was obviously told he would be safe to go to France for Memorial Day, and he wasn't. And that summons remains active, by the way. He can't go back to Paris without triggering it again. And I don't think he had any plans to go on a holiday in Chile, frankly, or in Spain or Argentina or East Timor or Cyprus or Bangladesh or Cambodia. So there are obviously other ways in which jurisdictions don't apply. But here's what I think should happen. When Richard Nixon was about to be impeached, the first article of impeachment drawn up was for the illegal bombing of Cambodia. People forget this, but that was the original article of impeachment, for making war, levying war illegally without the knowledge or consent of Congress. And as we also all know, it was decided by a long process of log rolling in Congress and elsewhere that you, the American people, couldn't stand the trauma of an impeachment or a full-blown trial, would rather have a quiet life, and on the whole it would be better to have a pardon for the president, and the deal was, you know, this would put the Vietnam syndrome behind us and the healing process can begin, and you know how all this goes. This is the only culture in the history of the world where the expression, your history, is an insult. And we're always ceaselessly enjoined to develop more amnesia. Let's move on, let's put this behind us. Well, it didn't work, did it? The president of the college where I teach in New York, the former Senator Kerry, has just found that, yeah, maybe he did take a knife to the throats of 5 children and 2 grandparents in the dark in the Mekong Delta, about 5 weeks after Nixon was inaugurated, oddly enough. A prominent local historian I see can't get his story straight either about that period. There's no burying the Vietnam syndrome, take it from me. Not while any of us is alive who remembers it anyway. So we should go back and restart the trial. It seems to me Congress should become seized of the matter, admit that the attempt to bury that epoch was a failure, and convene hearings and decide to let the chips fall where they may, make it up to the victims as far as is possible, and punish the guilty. If that can't be done, there's no way this country can face the rest of the world, it seems to me. Just no way at all.
Gentleman in the white T-shirt.
Thank you very much for coming. Sorry, the mic is going all around. Your point about America taking responsibility for Kissinger is well taken. I'm an active member in the movement to bring the actions of George Bush and the Supreme Court to light, and was wondering what, or more specifically, what names of individuals that we as Americans can write to or call or whomever to help. Henry Kissinger is a stain. His actions are a stain on all of us, and what we as Americans can do to bring him to justice here in this country. It's great that he's being chased in France and Chile and elsewhere, but we should do it here. And
yes, good for you. Well, what I hope will happen shortly is that a large number of individuals and also human rights organizations will publish some kind of statement saying that, because I forgot to add, the Bush administration takes the view that Henry Kissinger doesn't have to answer these summonses. The judge in Paris, Judge Leloir, was told by the American embassy to write to Washington, to the State Department, if he wanted information about the missing French people in Chile. And his reply, I thought it was a very good one, was to say he'd already done that several times and received no reply. He wrote in the Clinton years, they didn't even give him a reply. So that's why he wanted to summons them. At present, it is the view of the US government, Henry Kissinger doesn't have to answer the questions. And it's also the view of the American mass media that it doesn't meet the definition of news, that he's being asked. Well, there are things you can do about both those things, it seems to me. A way to start would be, we as Americans think it's a disgrace that Henry Kissinger is sheltered by the US government from magistrates in 3 democracies who have questions that only he can answer. It's only a small thing, but believe you me, he dreads it. And he won't make a public appearance where he thinks he'll be asked that question. Otherwise, why would he have had David Gergen going to question him the other day? I'm serious. I mean, he's terrified of that question and its implications. And so for a relatively small concentration of effort, and after all, it's something very easy to explain to anybody and very easily intelligible, you get, I promise you, a very big return. But finally, it does seem to me it's the responsibility of Congress, as has been shouldered by the Congresses of every other democratic country that's been through a period of being a rogue state or an illegitimate regime, and both those things apply to the Nixon-Kissinger gang. Look, Nixon copped a plea, but as we know from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, acceptance of a plea means acceptance of guilt. Spiro Agnew had to go. I'm just thinking of the people who put the Nixon gang together in the first place. John Mitchell, the other Paris conspirator, the first US Attorney General ever to actually go to jail. Once or twice you get one. It happens. Justice is served. Okay? Kissinger's the only one unpunished of that group. The immunity and impunity is beginning to look a bit lonely. Then look at his international colleagues, Pinochet, Suharto, General Papadopoulos in Greece. These guys are all either in jail in their own countries or are fighting desperately in the most pathetic technicalities to prevent themselves from being sent there. That's what's happened to his international colleagues. Again, the immunity begins to strike one as obscene, and the United States is sheltering this person, right? I mean, it couldn't be any clearer.
There's a gentleman up to my right. Yes, you. With the, he just put his hand up. Yeah, gentleman standing up.
I agree with your the basic theory of your book, but my question is, don't you think that the American political establishment is afraid and so corrupt that they would never bring this man to justice? Because if they do that, they should bring Bob McNamara to justice, they should bring Bush Sr. to justice. I mean, there's a whole, I mean, half of Washington should, I mean, they should go, I mean, they are, I mean, and half of Washington, I mean, have committed crimes against humanity.
I'm asked to repeat the question, though I can tell that some of you certainly got the import of it. Actually, it seems that people did, I think. There used to be, during the period of the Fourth Republic in France, very crazed, corrupted colonial warfare period in the 40s and early 50s. There was a game that some friends of mine in Paris used to play. They would send the identical telegram to every minister in whatever the government was that week. The telegram, when opened, would simply read, "Fly at once, all is discovered." They would then see how many ministers went straight to the airport. If you were to do that in Washington, you would fill the cardiac ward of Georgetown Hospital. It's certainly true. But this question comes up in different forms all the time, and what I want to urge you is this. There's every reason to single Kissinger out, and I'm sure you'll agree I've given you some. Why am I singling him out? Because he's unique. That's why. And because his survival of these episodes of gangsterism, where the others have been punished, is remarkable and salient. That's why. Okay. So my injunction to you would be, don't make the best the enemy of the good. But of course, I knew once Pinochet was arrested, it wouldn't stop there. Of course it won't stop there. But my old enemies in the British Special Branch were not told, go round to that clinic and arrest the Chilean military dictatorship and bring justice to Chile. They were told, you have a perfectly good warrant here, from a post-Franco Spanish magistrate. It's a good bill. Go round and serve it on Pinochet. Tell him he's nicked. Tell him he's under house arrest. And furthermore, tell him he can receive only visits from Baroness Thatcher. Which, if not cruel, is certainly fucking unusual. And then drag him before the House of Lords. But that's all they did. But I would never have believed any of that would happen. I never would have believed for a minute that could happen. But I did know it wouldn't stop there, and it hasn't. So in a way, your question answers itself. If you don't consent to live in a banana republic, right? If you don't just think you're a spectator and a consumer, but if you're a citizen, and if enough people do demand that justice is done for Henry Kissinger, you can take my word for it, it won't stop there.
Woman in the first row in the beige blouse.
Okay, I have two points. Does it not work? Okay, the first question is, there was some mention made at the beginning when you were just starting, or before you started, about a campaign to bring Henry Kissinger to justice, and it appears there's some organized effort that I haven't heard of within this country. Anyway, that's one question, because people always want to know what they can do. And then the second is just an observation, which I feel I'm taking a risk in saying, but I would just like to request that more women be chosen to ask questions, because I noticed that only 2 have been.
I'll exempt myself. Did everyone? No. Very well. The lady asks, was she right in thinking that she may have missed something at the beginning, that I referred to a campaign to bring justice to Henry Kissinger? And if so, what more could I tell you about it? And then she drew attention to the fact that not enough members of the female sex were being called upon to ask questions. Was that a fair précis? If you're right. I am going to skip the second bit because I rather deftly avoided the invidia of choosing the questioners. But you can count on it. Many, many more girls would have been picked if I'd been doing the choosing. It's just that they don't speak up, you know. The second thing is, no, I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. There is no such campaign as yet, but there are what you might call concerted developments in a lot of countries, and they're being noticed by more and more people, and they're being noticed above all by the great man himself. So there's a process going on, but it needs to be much more publicized, and it needs to be much more energetically supported. There's another way, by the way, in which this may become an American domestic matter. That is another place for you to direct your mail. The criminal division of the US Justice Department now has enough information in its possession to issue an indictment of General Pinochet for the setting off of a car bomb in rush hour traffic in downtown DC, just a few hundred feet from where I live, actually, in October of 1976, that murdered Orlando Letelier, the Chilean exile, and his American friend, Ronnie Moffett. It's still very illegal to let off car bombs in Washington, D.C. at rush hour, even if you don't kill an American citizen. And the question would become this: why has that indictment not been issued? They have the evidence. It is their job as Justice Department to defend us from enemies, foreign and domestic. Why not? If they have the evidence, why aren't they proceeding with it? And second, since most of what was needed to form that conclusion was known within, I would say, about 10 seconds of the bomb going off, but certainly was established within a matter of weeks after it, why has it taken 26 years to get to this point? There must clearly have been obstruction of justice in Washington at quite a high level. There was, too. I'm not guessing. I know what the answers to these questions are. Now, this is quite a grave matter. Is a law and order Republican regime to say that it's all right by them for foreign governments to let off car bombs in Washington, D.C.? Surely that can't be right. What will the Massachusetts delegation to Congress say about that? Don't you think you have a say in it? And if the Attorney General believes he knows to order this bomb set off and doesn't say, or doesn't prosecute him, ought the Attorney General not to be immediately impeached? These questions all answer themselves, and they're all for you to ask. And if you want me to say, who would it be who'd been obstructing justice in the Letelier-Pinochet investigation, I can only say, guess. But all this is coming to critical mass too, as are the various fallouts of the Chilean engagement. You know, some of us took an oath when that coup occurred and when our friends in Chile were murdered, and when the Chilean fascists then sent people to murder our friends in Washington, D.C., we said we would never, ever forget this, and we would punish them for it. We'll see it through, and we will. It will happen. I promise you, it will.
I was going to thank the woman for making her observation and for taking the risk. So oh, the woman in the orange.
Sir, I wanted to tell you that my homeland, I left my homeland in 1972 because of the severe repression, political repression, Iran, under the Shah's regime. My family and myself were victim of his policy. I know that Kissinger, for at least as far as I know and witness, he was almost the closest friend and military consultant, political consultant of Shah during his 25 years of his dictatorship. I would like to ask you, sir, would it be enough evidence for Kissinger to be guilty of all the crimes that Shah committed toward his people? And my other question would be, what would be your feelings or your thoughts about his policy toward Middle East in general, especially in years of 60s and 70s and early 80s? Thank you.
Okay. I can direct you to two, and anyone else who's interested, to two very interesting books about Kissinger's relationship to the Pahlavi dictatorship. One was by Jack Anderson and was about the way in which Kissinger helped the Shah, among other things, to manipulate the oil price, but also helped cover up the crimes committed by his notorious secret police force, the Savak, and in other ways gave him military and diplomatic and other forms of friendship and protection. The second book is by William Shawcross. It's called The Shah's Last Ride, and it's about how Kissinger tried to get a safe house for the Shah in this country when he was thrown out of Iran by his own people. But the reason it didn't find its way into my book, though I thought about it a lot and I know a certain amount about it, is that I really think in this case that was a United States government institutional policy pursued ever since the Eisenhower years by all officials of all American governments and political parties, was that the Shah belonged to the United States, and also large bits of the United States belonged to the Shah. That was an all-party agreement. It was one of the things that really bonded the local ruling class. You couldn't very well indict just Kissinger for it, though he was an unusually enthusiastic supporter of the policy. So there, you see what I mean. I don't always say that it's all him. His policy in the Middle East, I don't know if I have time really to, your question is so generally phrased, but again, his policy in the Middle East was one of basically cynical short-termism, as is the case with most of his diplomacy. He doesn't deserve his reputation for being a cold, detached, Machiavellian diplomat at all. Most of his policies were very improvised, very unskillful, generally ending in disaster, very ill-considered, and with an eye to very short-term consequences in the American domestic market. And that was particularly true of his supposed shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. I can tell you a good story about his relationship with the media, if you like, to do with his views of the Intifada, if you'd like to hear a good story about Ted Koppel. But it's a bit of a come-down from the seriousness of your question. It just occurs to me, because it's a thing that I try and emphasize wherever I go, is the extent to which my own profession has compromised itself in covering up for this man. I think that's part of the cultural crisis, as is the case with Simon & Schuster, one of our flagship publishers, knowingly publishing fabricated and distorted and falsified memoirs by Kissinger. We now have the documents, some of them anyway, on which he based his book, and we can prove that his scholarship standard is lower than that of David Irving. If he did what he did, if he'd done what he's done in the academy, he would be fired by now. But he's made a second fortune out of it with the connivance of the chieftains of American publishing. Anyway, to the Intifada, when the first Intifada broke out in the 1980s, there was a terrific shock in this country, as you'll remember, and in the media too, partly because nothing reported in the American press up till then had given people the impression there was likely to be a rising en masse of the people of occupied Palestine, living under a Pax Americana, who decided they'd rather die than go on living under it any longer. Anyway, there was a big shock, and the American Jewish Committee convened a series of meetings in New York to ask the advice of important people about it. And they invited Kissinger to one of their breakfasts. And he advised them the following. He said, this rebellion, which is what it is, must be put down at once, without compunction, without pity, and at great speed, and with great ruthlessness. And for this to happen, it will be necessary first to remove all the American and foreign mass media from the scene, because what will need to be done cannot be done in front of the cameras or with reporters present. And some people at the AJC meeting were good enough to leak this, and it was the usual Kissinger pseudo-realism, of course. Imagine if they had tried to do that. This is not Machiavellianism at all. It's a sort of sadistic fantasy of the kind that I think he quite often indulges in. And there were comments about the stupidity of it, at least, quite widespread in the press, but I thought, well, wait a minute, I've got a question. And so I rang Ted Koppel of Nightline, and I said, you saw the statement? He said, yeah. I said, well, I have three questions for you. One, does the man who calls for the physical removal of the American media from a large area of American foreign policy concern still hold his job as your news consultant at Nightline? Second, how much do you pay him for it? And third, Mr. Koppel, is it true that Henry Kissinger once said that if he became Secretary of State again, he would make you, Mr. Koppel, his Secretary for Europe? And is it true that you said that you'd be honored to accept? So he'd called me back, which I think was decent of him. And he said to the first question, yes, he's going to stay on as our news consultant. To the second question, I'm not going to tell you how much we pay him. And to the third question, yes, he did say that about making me Secretary for Europe, and yes, I would be very honored to accept. Now, this is the flagship show of the American eggheads, as it were. This is not, you know, trash TV. This is supposed to be the most impartial and neutral and careful examination that TV does, and those are its standards, and that's what this guy does to everything he touches. But that's also the complicity of my trade in his filthy career.
The woman in the fourth row.
The early 70s, the Kansas City Star had an article reporting on a stockholders meeting at ITT in the city at that time. A small stockholder got up and asked the chairman of the board if ITT had offered $1 million for Allende's head. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the corporate background of all this.
Yes. Should I first repeat the question? The lady reminds me that there was a report in the Kansas City Star in the early 70s, of a board meeting of ITT, the International Conglomerate of Communications, where a small shareholder had got up and asked, was it true that the company had at one point offered $1 million as a bounty for the removal of Allende from power in Chile? Would that be a fair précis of your question? And she asked me further to comment on the corporate involvement in the coup in Chile. Well, that's a now extraordinarily well-documented story. I have a little of it in my book. Richard Nixon, in his years of political failure in the 50s and 60s, had gone into the practice of law with John Mitchell, among other things, later jailbird and Attorney General. And the first person to give him any corporate work was Donald Kendall of Pepsi-Cola. And Pepsi-Cola is a huge employer in South America. And it is certainly true, and has been established beyond doubt by the congressional investigation, that on the day after Allende was elected, Donald Kendall was able to get Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, and Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, to a meeting to discuss how to restore order in Pepsi-Cola Land. And it was at that meeting that Nixon wrote his famous memo saying there's an unlimited budget for doing this, make their economy scream, bring about a coup, prevent Allende from being, by the way, this was not being elected because he'd been elected. He'd already been chosen. It was to prevent him from taking office. Chile has a similar transition period to the United States. I think it's 30 days between election and inauguration, and they wanted to use that time to destroy him. And yes, that was done at the behest particularly of Kendall, but of some other businessmen too, including a man, I think I remember the name as being Janine, who was the head of ITT. But there's, if you can look up Anthony Sampson's history of the corporation if you want to know more. It's the sort of thing that makes you think that Bertolt Brecht was not trying, you know. It's like an absolute Marxism for infants thing, where the huge fat thugs in the corporate boardrooms call up the politicians who they own and ask them to opt for fascism because the workers are becoming troublesome. I mean, that's exactly what happened. Not since United Fruit in Guatemala has there been such a classic case of it. But remember that the banana republic that results is the United States. Because the tactics of combining junta with plebiscite, with invisible government and bribery become imported. They come back. The war comes back home, except that unfortunately no one fights it. Yet.
Gentleman here in the fifth row.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us to what degree does Kissinger, either directly or indirectly, continue to shape American foreign policy?
Yes, I was asked, does Henry Kissinger still have an influence on the formulation or the conduct of American foreign policy? My impression is that that influence is waning a little bit. The people in the Bush administration who remember him from the Ford administration, notably Cheney and Rumsfeld, don't particularly like what they remember, because Kissinger was a vicious infighter in both Nixon and Ford administrations. A lot of the Republican right has always thought of Kissinger as soft on communism, which, by the way, he is, and always has been. It was Kissinger who prevented Gerald Ford from receiving the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn at the White House, because it might upset Kissinger's friend Leonid Brezhnev. And of course, it's always been Kissinger who defends the record and successes of Mao Zedong and their right to massacre their own students. So that's why I won't take any red baiting from him, among other things. So there's some of his friends try it sometimes. I'm ready for them. The right wing doesn't like him, in my view, for quite good reasons. And in the last election, Kissinger was reduced, because he still hires himself on as consultant on foreign policy to candidates, to being the consultant for Rick Lazio, and even worse, in my opinion, as a human being, Bill Bradley. Now that's pretty pathetic. So, you know, it's like watching a dying elephant, really. No, it isn't like watching that, because that would evoke sympathy.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, one from a man and one from a woman. We haven't really hit anybody on this side over here. Anybody else over on that side?
There's a chap up there.
There's a chap right there in the yellow shirt.
Could you comment on a Colonel Goleniewski? He was head of Polish intelligence, later went to the KGB. He defected to the West and provided a vast amount of information, all of which was accurate, according to a statement made when he was cited by the House of Representatives for his contributions. He made the rather startling allegation that Kissinger was a Soviet spy as far back as 1946 with the code name of BOR. I was very surprised to learn it. And the only thing I can say is if someone in the House of Representatives somehow supports this man and what he's said, do you have any comments on that?
I really hate saying that something comes to me as a complete surprise, that I know absolutely nothing about it at all, that I can't even speculate, and so on, but I have to say that in this case. I also have to be true to it. I have nothing to add. By all means.
Thank you.
I don't think they got a very good return on their investment if they were, but no, I shouldn't comment at all.
One last question.
The chicks have gone quiet again.
Is there a question over there? Oh, okay, here. No, we've already asked the question.
It's a small article in the Boston Globe some years ago in the back pages about Dr. Kissinger and one of our local people, John Silber, going to Central America on a fact-finding mission together. Shortly after that, Mr. Silber ran for governor here. I don't want to be playing conspiracy theories, but I wonder if Mr. Kissinger indulges in domestic activities as well.
When my material on Kissinger first appeared, it was as a series of articles in Harper's Magazine. By the way, those of you who read that, don't get the idea you've read the book. There's much more in the book, and you need your own reference copy. But quite a bit was in Harper's. And John Silber was one of the people who wrote in, because I'd mentioned that Central America Commission. Reagan appointed Kissinger the chair of a commission on Central America, on which John Silber served, and which Oliver North was the security man for and stuff. And it went to Central America and it whitewashed the death squads and the Guatemalan government and all the things you'd expect it to do. But because there were a couple of sort of soggy Democrats on it for balance, there was some recommendations about, well, maybe we should link some of our donations of aid to less death squad activity, stuff like that, bleats like that went in. So Tip O'Neill kind of stuff went in. As a result of which, there was a dissenting minority report saying, the hell with all that, it's soft on communism, signed by Kissinger and Silber, dissenting from their own hardline report. I mean, nothing is mad or cruel enough for these guys. So I had a great exchange with Silber in the correspondence columns about that. And do I think Henry Kissinger intervenes domestically? By all means, I think so. I mean, I think that's very much to the purpose. What Henry Kissinger believes and has learned from the theories of history that he started with and the examples of history he studied and the sorts of people with whom he scraped acquaintance in his academic and political career, that the lessons of dictatorship learned from history and from contact with dictators overseas need to be assimilated and applied to the United States of America. He makes it very clear in all his books that the enemy is democracy. Okay, in particular, it's the enemy to the conduct of foreign policy. But of course he doesn't leave it at that. He wanted the Nixon administration to become a full-fledged authoritarian regime. He wanted it to break the law, have the courage to do so, to destroy the evidence, to face down Congress, and all the rest of it. It's the classic demonstration of what happens to metropolitan imperialist countries. They cannot oppress other people and themselves be free. Some people realize this reluctantly. Some of them deny the realization even when it's presented to them, and some welcome it. And Kissinger is one of the third type. No, that's nice. Thank you. Thank you, James.
I'd like to remind you all that books are for sale outside of the auditorium in the lobby, and I'd like to thank both Christopher and you, the audience, for joining us this evening. Thank you.
That didn't seem too short at all. Will you let it run?